So I really hate introductions at the start of these sorts of things because they go on, and you're sitting there going, why on earth do I care what this guy's going to say? And hopefully we're going to walk our way through a discussion of China tonight that's a little different than most of the other discussions that you've engaged in regarding China. Because often there's a lot of rhetoric, misunderstanding, and assumptions that get made about U.S.-China relations that lead us down some interesting and potentially problematic paths. And so rather than suggesting a type of foreign policy or a policy outcome to you, what we're going to talk about is how can we think about China in a way that then lets us and policymakers make more constructive decisions in relation to them. Now, as you can probably guess, I am not Ethan. I'm the Ryan on the book. Ethan is my co-author. And Ethan worked with me at AIER over the period that we were writing this book. And this book is really sort of Ethan's baby, because Ethan spent a lot of time writing about China while he was at AIER. But like many folks, he was casting around for a way to understand China that wasn't just these one-off things that either complained or was concerned about or thinking about China. And so when we started to work together, we began to ask the question, is there a better way to think about China using the tools of the economist to do so? And hopefully that's what we've done in the book. So Ray introduces me as a political scientist. That's true. I'm entirely trained as a political scientist and promptly ran away from the discipline, primarily because I discovered that political scientists make far less money than economists. Shocking, I know. But as over the course of my career, I've mostly worked in the public choice arena, which is where I got to know Ray when he was at North Dakota State, which was a delightful time. So we're going to talk about what we call the China dilemma and rethinking U.S.-Chinese relations through public choice theory. But before we start into the meat of it, like I said, I'm from the American Institute for Economic Research. This is co-authored with Ethan. And I want to start with this picture. So I want everybody to look at the picture for a second and tell me what you see.
Color.
Color, okay. It's brightly colored. That's certainly true. Although the slideshow AI assistant added the color around the edge today. Okay, what? Complex infrastructure. What else? Okay, we see a clock. There's no people in the square. Now, to be fair, I took this picture at 1 a.m. So that there would be no people in it. But what is it that tells you this is China? Because this is actually a mid-sized city in western China's square.
The Chinese characters on the skyscraper.
Okay, so we can see some Chinese characters. What else? Okay, the fact that this talks about China does give it away. What were you about to say?
There's a star.
Okay, there is a star there, but you have to look pretty closely, right?
Ooh.
There's not a lot of giveaways when you first glance at the photo. If I just flash it on the screen, it'll be difficult to identify where in the world it is. Now, there's a couple of things that give it away. The Chinese characters and the lights on the building clearly point toward it being somewhere in Asia. It's one of the places where you see that particular set of light colors. Here's another picture. Okay, what do we notice in this picture? Okay, we got a pagoda in the center. It's much easier to tell here, right?
There's a lot of
Okay, a lot of brutalist architecture, but to be fair, that could be any mid-sized American city too. We had a little love affair with brutalism in the 1970s. The reason I start with these two pictures is because when we think about China, we often have had this notion of an exotic place that is entirely different. And what we're going to work our way through in this talk is that there are differences, but there is also a lot of similarity in how people think and what their fundamental beliefs, desires, and motivations are. They just express themselves in a different institutional arrangement that makes it a little bit more difficult for things to happen. So I always like to start with, this slide is somehow in order, but I usually like to start with these two people. So these are an elderly couple that are out in Western China. They're selling little like egg pancake things, and we were at a night market. and I was bugging the little older lady here. She'd said some terrible things to me in Chinese, and I speak almost no Chinese, but I know the really mean bad words. And I kept bugging her, trying to get her grandson to answer some questions about, well, why were they here? This is about 11 o'clock at night selling pancakes in the market, selling these little treats that they had. And finally, because I just won't go away, she eventually agrees to let the grandson translate for her so that I will leave her the hell alone. And the root of my question was, why? Why are you here? What do you think her answer was? To make money. And we talked for a little bit more through the grandson, and eventually the same sort of motivations we get from almost everyone started to be expressed. Namely, that they were working to try to figure out a better life for that grandson, for themselves, and those motivations were rooted at the core of most of what we understand about human nature and human understanding from economics. And so part of the lesson from all of this is that when we begin an approach to ask questions, for example, how do we interact with China, this big giant question, we start with some commonalities. Adam Smith gives us the commonalities, right? He gives us the tendency of humanity to truck, barter, and trade. And at the core, if you walk around the night markets in China or you walk around and talk to the small business owners there, that capacity is ingrained and it is there, just being expressed through different institutions that make it either easier or tougher to do so. So let's talk about approaches. My whole slideshow got screwed up. Imagine that I would come in to do this. So we're going to talk about some of the approaches to understanding China. So it turns out there's a whole bunch of political approaches that are used right now in Washington, D.C., and my co-author, who likes to go to these things, I'm not generally allowed to go to them anymore. These are these little gatherings around Capitol Hill where you go talk to politicians. I'm apparently a little blunt with politicians and might suggest that they're, well, no damn good. Turns out politicians don't love that, but Ethan likes to go to these things. And he was at one of these talking with one of the elected senators we'll talk about in a second. And when the senator was asked, what about China? His response was this sort of typical tough-talking Washington, D.C. He said, Western businesses and financiers are selling the Chinese Communist Party the rope it will use to hang the United States. There's a lot in that, right? There's a lot built into that set of assumptions from somebody who's going to be involved in the making of U.S.-China foreign relations policy that we have to unpack. Because it starts with an assumption, not just of self-interest on the part of the Chinese, but rather of actual malevolent interest. And that ultimately, by engaging with them and selling products and purchasing from them, we're headed down this path towards them being able to succeed in this. And this is part of what got Ethan particularly interested, was trying to ask the question, well, is this true? And is there another way to try to understand China that might give us more insight? Because even if it is true, understanding them will let us better come up with how to do public policy. So, there's another set of approaches though, right? There's the academic approaches. Anybody in here a political scientist like me? Although I usually hide that fact. No political science majors. I got one. Okay, so there's generally international relations has a whole bunch of theories, right? Yeah. So the academic approaches tend to be rooted in theories that view states as singular actors. So they talk about China, as opposed to China as a collection of individuals engaged in the institutional arrangements that govern China. They often view those entire countries at this rational actor level, that somehow China has interests and China takes action to achieve those interests. And we're a little bit skeptical of that because we look at the United States, and how many of us would say the United States is a single rational actor? Anybody want to make the argument for that point at the moment? No. We look around the United States and we see that the United States has lots of competing interests and that it may want to project that it's a single actor, but all you have to do is watch one administration to the next change and the priorities change and the actions change. And so if you're going to understand United States policy, you have to understand something about the people that inhabit the offices and what they care about and how they interact. And so we look at it and say, that assumption is, if it's bad for us, it's also probably not a good assumption if we're going to really understand China well. And so we step in with a different approach, what we call public choice. How many of you have heard the words public choice before? And Edward Ray, you can't raise your hands. Okay. Public choice is a relatively simple concept. It says, when we think about the market or we think about the economic world, we assume that people have preferences and that they take action to achieve them. Right? Everybody with me so far? You go to the store, you have something you want, you take some action to try to get that. Generally, we call that trade, and we often use money to denominate those transactions. But the root assumption is the preference and the action to achieve it. Public choice takes that assumption and moves it into what they originally called non-market decision-making. Great name made up by economists. Don't let economists name things. We're really, really bad at it. And say, well, those same people that act this way in the marketplace are also acting in other places, often in government, for example. And they still come with a set of preferences, and they're still going to take action to achieve them. They don't magically change when they walk in to the halls of the Senate or the House of Representatives. Their preferences might change a little bit because they may want to stay in those places, but they're still going to have preferences and take action to achieve them. And so our argument is that if you're going to understand international relations well, and particularly the Chinese-US interactions, you have to start with the same fundamental understanding, that the relevant players involved are individual people with interests that they're going to take action to try to achieve. That means understanding the Chinese system and the players becomes incredibly important. Kissinger understood this. It was the root of Kissinger's foreign policy approach. Now, I have lots of semi-mean things to say about Kissinger and some of his policy choices, but it was something he understood pretty clearly. And so when we think about this, we're often asking questions like Shugart from a 2023 piece that talks about how actors primarily are making self-interested decisions, decisions that achieve their preferences, a lot like it looks in the private sector. And when we think about this in sort of the governmental realm, we're thinking about it in terms of what do people want, what are the constraints in the form of institutions they face, and what will they do to achieve it. So, let's talk about China for a second, because that's a whole lot of big fancy words. So how do we actually think about China using this approach? Well, we had to ask ourselves a big question when we started the book, which was, why on earth did there need to be another book about US-China relations? There are hundreds of them, and we are either delusional, which I will grant is a possibility, or we've hit on something a little bit unique. I hope we've done the latter. Maybe we've done the former, and I'm just delusional. But we're looking at trying to understand what motivates. What was going on? That if China's not just a single monolithic actor that has its own interests as China, how do we then come to understand things like the draconian policies with the Uyghurs or the seemingly bizarre actions they take by flying over Taiwan periodically? And so we start with not an encyclopedic knowledge of China. Ethan has that, thank heavens. I have a really good handle on the tools of public choice, and then when I have a question about China, I tell Ethan to go find me the answer, and he does. It's great. But what we're interested in is taking those tools and saying, can we understand what motivates China in ways that we didn't before? And so, as we get started, we want to see if public choice allows us to address the misunderstandings in the current dialogue by revealing the incentives of the decision makers that are at play. And everything we talk about doing with respect to China, you could easily do on the flip side with respect to the United States. So let's talk about some of the unproductive ways that we think exist to analyze U.S.-China relations. There have been a lot of them over the years. So we'll start with pure realism. Okay, anybody that's taken an international relations class will recognize the term realism, and it's really the core of states as actors, that states have their own set of interests, it's national security focused, and they're going to take actions that are in the best interest of the state. We've talked a little bit about why we're unconvinced by that as a motivation, that we don't see the U.S. simply doing this. We see lots of conflict in making that decision, and so what might look like a pure realist response is something far more nuanced. The second way is the liberal theory of trade and liberalization. Now, a few folks in this room clearly remember the 1990s. Anybody remember when the answer to China was we were going to trade with them and there would be McDonald's in Tiananmen Square and they would be sewing soccer balls and their economy would be liberalizing and at the same time they would turn into a Western-style democracy. Anybody remember that theory? Yeah. How'd that work out? Well, we got the economic liberalization for a while, but we didn't see the second part come. We didn't see the Western-style democracy emerge, and eventually we actually saw crackdowns on that democratic movement. So it didn't quite work the way the theory predicted. Some more recent ones are things like cultural explanations. That, what goes on in China, there's no way, it's just the Chinese are different. At its core, this is what Mao said. Mao said they were going to do communism with Chinese characteristics, meaning there was something special and unique about Chinese culture that made them different. This has been, in the old days, this was referred to by a term that is now out of fashion, and I'm not going to say it out loud because it will get me in trouble because I'm being recorded, but if you Google cultural explanations, you'll find the term that's used. And ultimately what it says is, well, it's just the Chinese are different. Again, if Smith is right, and if some of our understanding about what motivates people is right, that's probably not a good enough explanation for what happens. And then we got the special one that emerged about 15 to 20 years ago, and that it's all about colonial power dynamics. Well, maybe, but China was also a colonial power and a colonized power, so I don't know how those two things play off of each other. But it also doesn't give us a good grounding in understanding what motivates the current regime. Because we're now almost 100 years on from any period in China that would be able to be classified as colonial. And so when we look at these sort of standard approaches, we end up with less productive ways that leave us lacking something in our understanding. I've read quite a lot in each of these areas, and I always walk away with the same sort of questions. And those questions are almost always, well, then what does motivate them? You pointed out what could, but what's the connection to what actually is happening? So let's talk about what we do in the book a bit. So our basic methodology, we're going to look at public choice, not monolithic public interest. We're not looking at it and saying, this is what China should be. I don't know what China should be. The Chinese government doesn't know what China should be. The Taiwanese don't know what China should be. But we can look at it and say, this is what is. What is motivating the players that are engaged? We're also going to make sure we understand the Leninist system that prevails in China. It's wonderful that the Cold War ended and all of the Sovietologists lost their jobs because we don't have to study the Soviet Union anymore. But it means an entire sector of knowledge left, and that is the study of Leninist systems. Okay, who recognized what a Leninist system would be? What's a Leninist system, friend?
It's a heavy focus on a single vanguard party of communism where they lead the country and they lead the cultural policies and to shaping it into a communist utopia.
Okay, so that
Vladimir Lenin during the Russian Revolution.
Okay, so that is the poster child explanation of what they would tell us a Leninist system looks like. It's accurate, but the system is characterized by what are known as interlocking directorates in order to do and carry out what you just described. And China operates as a Leninist system, meaning there are interlocking directorates that are made up at the local, the provincial, and the national level that are all connected through committees, essentially, that connect them. It looks very different than a Western-style liberal democracy, meaning the institutions are different. And if we're going to understand China, we have to understand the difference in those institutions. And it's one of the things that if you listen to elected officials in the United States talk for very long, it's pretty clear they don't get the difference between what the institutions are. We're also going to do political economy, not moral economy. Meaning we're going to ask questions about what motivates people and what leads them, not what should motivate them. Okay? Those are good discussions, but they're not discussions that are going to be useful if we're going to understand how to interact with them. They're important questions. They're just not the ones that are going to get us to better policy. And that we're dealing not with subservient or inherently anti-capitalist citizens. There's not something that just makes them anti-capitalist in China, but rather they're rational in the economic sense, meaning they have preferences and take action they think will help them achieve it. They're self-interested. And in fact, if you get to the ground, there's lots of market transactions happening every day in China. If you wander through the markets of China, there's few places that are more sort of on-the-ground, nitty-gritty capitalism than those markets. So our approach starts here. So let's talk about the book. So this is the layout of the book. There are copies out there. If anyone doesn't get a copy, I have a card up here. Send me an email and I'll have our book people mail you a copy of the book, or we'll send you the PDF of it. But we walk through basically some of the history and the layout of China as a frame, and then we talk really about the CCP, the history of China and how it relates, and then we walk through what we think is the actual cause of most of our misunderstanding, and that's a switch to nationalism and Chinese identity from economic growth as the motivator of the CCP. At the core, that's what we argue, is that through the 1990s and early 2000s, the CCP saw economic growth that was tremendous by market liberalization. When that started to peter out as incomes rose and we hit the middle income trap where it's harder to grow at those rates, we saw this switch to nationalism as the justification for the CCP's rule. So let's dig into that a little bit. So the ultimate basic needs come from stability and economic growth. There's a government that serves the interests of the people if it's achieving those things. Most people are not political theorists or even dissidents, but they will fight back eventually if they're pushed far enough. And most people were tired of the chaos before the establishment of the CCP. It was a time of pretty high chaos, and there were lots of promises made by Mao and others about stability and economic growth. And the CCP did a few things really well initially, and then some things really, really badly for a long time. And then starting in 1978, the trajectory changed again pretty dramatically. But questions still lie ahead for where they're headed. So let's talk a little bit about I lost my slide with the graph on it. It's amazing what happens when you switch computers. So my apologies. So imagine here you have a graph that looks roughly like this. It's going up at some peaks. And you have Mao coming to power and a deep dive down. You have a little bit of a rebound and then another dive down. This just gets better and better. The Chinese did it, huh? I don't know what just happened. So that's all right. I'll keep talking because we're going to imagine the graph together for a while. So, and then we have in 1978, Deng comes to power. Okay? Mao is now essentially, he's deceased by this point, and Deng comes into power and decides to do market liberalization. Anybody see this graph? What happens?
At which point?
In 1978, when the market liberalizations take root, they shoot up, right? And they see massive economic growth. And then starting in the sort of mid-early 2000s, we see it start to level off. And at that point, we see a change in the rhetoric. And that change ends up moving from talking about how the justification of the CCP is because they delivered economic growth and material increases every year to talking about China's history, its greatness, and its national identity. Now, think back again, because right now there should be a giant picture of Xi on the screen. All right, we have it back. See if I can get to Xi. Nope, it's just gone. All right, so now imagine there's a giant picture of Xi right there. Not the nice young woman, but Xi, okay? Who is Xi? What is Xi? XI.
He's the party secretary.
Okay, he's the party secretary, he's the premier, he's the head of the CCP in China. What do we know about it? What do you know about it?
He's not
What's that?
not quite as liberal as his predecessor.
Well, he's not as liberal as his predecessor. He's not sort of the same market reformer as a predecessor. What else do we know about it?
He's the face of the country.
He's the face of the country. We certainly recognize him. We could see him. If I put him up here, you all will recognize him. What else do we know?
He's put a heavy emphasis on the military and
Okay, he's put an emphasis on military and its development. That's certainly true. But Xi takes power in a very interesting moment in China. Okay, a moment where even the Chinese official figures are starting to show economic growth has slowed pretty dramatically. And we want to think and use public choice for a second to talk about Xi. Because it's easy to envision him as the megalomaniac evil leader of China. And there are a number of U.S. senators that like to describe it in just those terms. But ultimately, what motivates Xi? Okay, maybe money. Okay, power. What does Xi want to continue to be? He continues to want to be the general secretary of the Communist Party of China. What do we know about Leninist systems?
Right.
What happens if you're the general secretary of the party in a Leninist system?
Can you say you have absolute
What's that?
have absolute
You have absolute power until what happens?
they give way around. You are the cutie.
It turns out that when you dig very deeply into Leninist directorates, there's competition happening within them. And so President Xi has to figure out how to remain. So why do Leninist dictators get rid of their opponents?
because they challenge.
They challenge power in interesting and problematic ways. So a few years ago, there was the previous chairman of the party that was at a meeting of the National Assembly that was going to speak. And he was removed from that speaking engagement. Anybody remember this incident? It showed up in the news quite a lot. There was lots of speculation about why he was removed. People were like, oh, he's going to denounce Xi. It's pretty clear that's not the case. He had never spoken against Xi before. Instead, it's pretty clear, looking at some of the sources that came from China, that he was actually likely to stand up and give his full-throated support to Xi. Why would Xi be concerned about that happening? Think so.
Move later if he poses a significant threat.
Okay, maybe it's that he could be a threat later on. That's certainly possible. Why else could it be? That he gets, then he still has a significant power base. Okay? And those that operate with a significant power base that are not the leader of the party himself pose a risk. Think about what happened with folks like Jack Ma. Jack Ma is a billionaire in China. What happens to Jack Ma? What does the Chinese Communist Party do to him?
Tears.
Well, they disappear him for a while. They remove him from the leadership of his companies, right? Why?
Alan.
Because he wielded too much in.
He had built his own independent power base. This is what public choice does. It says that as we start to look at these things, and if we can identify what people's preferences are and look at what's occurred, we can start to have some understanding of what motivated him. Because it wasn't just a megalomaniac dictator, terrible word that I just kept trying to say over and over again to you all, that just removed him because he was just pure evil. No, he's probably evil. But there was a reason why this person and not that. And that's really all we argue for in the book, is that if we're really going to understand China, it's not a simple thing. It's not simply China has an action and a belief, and an interest that we have to counter. That if we're going to really understand China, what we have to do is understand what motivates the leadership, whether that's Chairman Xi or that's those that are underneath him, and recognize that ultimately there was a reason why this day was important. Who recognizes this? Okay. Everybody, Tiananmen Square. What happens to this guy?
But how?
What's that? What happens to him?
That's lunch.
He what?
He climbs up on top of this bank as lunch.
He what happens in the end to him? He eventually gets removed, right? How many of you thought that he got run over by the tank? Or we finally, yeah, a few of you did. That was what a lot of people believed for a long time. That's not what happened. Why were they in Tiananmen Square?
They were protesting the government, how much authority they wielded. They wanted more liberalization in the government.
They were actually doing exactly what the liberal trade theory suggested was going to happen, right? They were students agitating for more. What we saw this day, the part that we remember, is not the violent day. The violent day was a couple of days before, where a number of student protesters were killed by the army. But this is the memory that we have. Why does this matter? Why is this still something the Chinese government thinks about?
Because if it can happen once, it can always happen again.
It can happen again. It was not a coordinated, outside agitated effort. It was internal. And it meant that there was a crackdown that started in the late 1980s on how much access to outside information would be allowed. So when that transition starts to occur, first in the 80s and then later on in the 2000s, we start to see that at least by 1989, the CCP is no longer a unifying force in China. It's a little bit more controversial. The estimates of how many party members there are have been declining virtually every year in China. They're a small minority of the Chinese population. Mao had charisma. I don't know how he did, but Mao had charisma. Everyone else was facing economic headwinds. It was only the liberalization starting under Deng that allowed them to push against it. Once that growth started to slow, the party itself, if you look at their rhetoric, decides that nationalism ends up being the path to try to hold the nation together with the CCP. And so they start things like a patriotic education campaign. On one of my first visits to China, so I would go over there for about a decade and teach for a few weeks at a time for Utah State University. We went to a movie theater, and the movie opened with a description of the Chinese dream. Clearly a ripoff of the American dream. It was moderately funny, but it laid out how the CCP was providing this new Chinese reality, that there wasn't just the economy, but China was on the resurgence, and that to be Chinese was to be something special. And as a result, there's been a new narrative of Chinese history written. And as we've seen challenges in the economy grow, we've seen greater pushes into this in China. So as things like the real estate crisis begins to deepen in China, you see a resurgence and a push up in the propaganda education side. Now, so what? Okay? Well, a couple of things. One is that it doesn't take us very long to look around and see that Chinese leaders are not actually the invincible figures we often make them out to be. If they were, Xi wouldn't be pulling people out and they wouldn't be purging them from Politburos. That's not a position you do if you're invincible, okay? And the Chinese themselves are rational and resemble us an awful lot. In fact, we all resemble each other. We're Smithian at our core. We have this tendency to truck, barter, and trade. But in reality, the CCP is going to take actions that it thinks will help keep it in power. And particularly, its leadership takes actions that will keep them in power. And so we end up seeing much more along the line of rational self-interest, not simply a good and evil narrative. And so in the end, much like we often say about American politicians, you have to look past what they say and actually look at what they do to understand their fundamental interests and what's likely to actually motivate them. So that's the end. I'm going to open it up to any questions that folks might have. But I do want to tell you about AIER for just a second, because I do have to make the shill. So we do a number of programs for students every year, as well as community members called Harwood Salons. That QR code will take you to it. We have internships, graduate fellowships, and student colloquia, as well as summer seminars that are week-long opportunities to talk about ideas for undergraduates and graduate students. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to